So what I want to show you in this video is that the Mayans were actually Egyptians, and the Egyptians were Mayans. So before I explain that, I want to just give a brief history about the land on the earth. You have to understand that in the beginning, the earth consisted of one huge supercontinent, where all of the land on earth was connected. This was called Pangaea. And as you can see, Africa and South America are connected. So after the breaking apart of this supercontinent, it formed what is called Gondwana. Gondwana was another supercontinent, but it was like Pangaea, but a little more spread apart. And Gondwana consisted of some of the first separations of these continents, but they were all still connected by what we call land bridges. And of course, scientists say that this took place over the course of millions of years. But the reality of this is that it did not take millions of years. It actually took just a few 100,000 years. The remnants of Gondwana today are South America, Australia, Africa, Antarctica, and the Indian subcontinent. And if we look at Beringia, also known as the Bering Land Bridge, this is the land bridge that was used by the original Native Americans who settled in North America. They supposedly migrated from Asia using the Bering Land Bridge, settling in North America, coming through Canada. So this Bering Land Bridge connects land in Asia, specifically in Russia and Siberia, connecting land all the way to Canada, and we know Canada is connected to North America. So this Bering Land Bridge was used just 5,000 years ago. So we know that it only took 5,000 years for this particular land bridge to be submerged underwater. So this tells us a few important things, that for one, this process didn't take millions of years, because we can clearly see the Bering Land Bridge being completely submerged just in a 5,000 year time frame. But it also tells us something very important about the earth, that the earth is slowly breaking apart, and not only that, that the land upon the earth is slowly being submerged underwater. This is something like the worldwide flood. This also explains why map making and atlas making changes throughout history, because the land upon the earth has changed also. So I just wanted to show you the ancient connection between Africa and South America, because this explains the presence of the H-block pyramids and the step pyramids that can be found in Africa and South America, because these land masses were once connected. So it explains the African presence in South America. So I uploaded a video not too long ago showing the connection between the ancient Kushite India and the inhabitants of South America. And I was just showing the similarities between the two civilizations. And at the end of that video, I added a clip from a video that I found online. This was a gentleman who was showing the tomb of a man that was buried in Egypt, and his name was Maya. And on the ceiling of his tomb, he had writing, ancient writing from the Chichen Itza language. Now, the Chichen Itza is a location in South America, and this is the location where the Mayans, it's one of the locations, one of the main locations that the Mayans would sacrifice humans. So we have this man named Maya buried in Egypt, and he has on the ceiling of his tomb the Chichen Itza language, and on the ceiling of the tomb in this language it says the date that he arrived and what he did when he came, and then he was buried in Egypt. Now the interesting thing about his tomb is that when he's buried in Egypt, the walls of the tomb are just like all of the Egyptians. He has all of your typical Egyptian hieroglyphs. He is shown on the wall as an Egyptian, dressed like an Egyptian. He is buried in the same manner as the Egyptians, and there is nothing that tells us that he's actually a Mayan other than the mural on the ceiling that shows us that he was from Mayan territory in Chichen Itza. So I decided to look at all of the books that I have on Egypt to see what I could find on Maya. And because one thing I've noticed is that, for one, I've never heard of this before. And two, I don't hear archaeologists talking about this. So I have at least 150 books on the subject of Egypt. And I was looking through all of these books. And of all of the books that I have on Egypt, I could only find one page in one book that speaks of Maya. And this is actually taken from a book that I have called The Complete Valley of the Kings, and it's by Nicholas Reeves. And this is on page 107. So first I want to read to you all of the titles that Maya held. Maya was the fan bearer on the king's right hand. He was the king's scribe. He was the overseer of the treasury, the overseer of the works in the place of eternity, and he was the leader of the festival of Amun at Karnak. And another important thing that it tells us about Maya is that his mother was Weret. So it says that he was born of the noble, lawly lady of the house of Weret. So we can learn a lot about Maya and who he is by looking at his mother. So before I explain Maya's mother, I want to explain the time frame in which Maya came into Egypt. So if you watch the Real Faces of the Bible Part 1, where I explained the Egyptians, in the end of that video I explained that Horemheb, who was the usurper of the Egyptian throne, he is the one responsible for murdering Tutankhamun and also Ai, who became king of Egypt after Tutankhamun died. So after Horemheb murders Tutankhamun and then Ai, he sets himself up as king of Egypt. So Maya comes into Egypt during this very same time. During the time of Horemheb, Horemheb commissioned for Maya to come into Egypt and restore the burial chamber of Tuthmosis. So this is a very important time because it marks the transition between the 18th dynasty and the 19th dynasty of Egypt. This is an extremely important time because the kings of Egypt of the 18th dynasty are the ones mentioned in the Bible, as I've explained in the Real Faces of the Bible. So we have Maya coming into Egypt at the specific time that Horemheb usurps the kingdom and murders the last kings of the 18th dynasty. And he is the one king that sits on the throne for a very brief time in between the 18th dynasty and the 19th dynasty. Now, historians will tell you that Horemheb gave the throne of Egypt to Ramses. Ramses was the first king of the 18th dynasty, and according to the history books, Horemheb gave the throne to Ramses. But this makes no sense because if Horemheb, who was a military official in the Egyptian army, who rose to a high status and then murdered the kings of Egypt, why would he do all of this to usurp the throne of Egypt and then turn around and give it back to the same family that he stole it from by giving it to Ramses? Ramses was of the Tuthmosis bloodline. So I don't believe that the throne was given back to the Egyptians by Horemheb, but in fact I believe that the Egyptians took it back. And if we look at Maya, he is an important piece of this puzzle because Maya comes into the land at the very same time that Horemheb sets himself up as king, and Horemheb commissions him to restore the burial chamber of Tuthmosis. So now I want to explain to you a little bit about Maya's mother. So Maya's mother is Weret, and Maya's mother can first be seen in the Temple of Amun, which is located at Karnak. She is seen on the 18th pylon of the Temple of Amun, and she is shown with Tuthmosis riding in the sacred boat. And according to the Egyptian hieroglyphs, Weret is also present during the coronation of Horemheb. She is the lady of the house of Weret and the mother of Maya. Maya is from South America and speaks the language of the Chichen Itza, so we know he is a Mayan. So this means that Maya's mother was a Mayan also. And we can first see the connection between Maya's mother and Tuthmosis that is mentioned on the 18th pylon of the Temple of Amun. And remember that Maya was the leader of the festival of Amun at Karnak. And he also restored the temple of Tuthmosis. Now this is very important because the titles held by Maya are all held and only held by direct descendants of the Egyptian kings. So when we see his mother next to Tuthmosis, and we see that she is the mother of Maya, and the fact that Maya restored the temple of Tut tells me, along with all of the titles that he held, tells us that Maya was the son of Tuthmosis, and his mother was Weret. Now, Weret is also present at the coronation of Ramses, which is the transition of this throne from Horemheb to Ramses. So Maya and his mother Weret are in Egypt and present during the coronation of Horemheb. Then they are present during the coronation of Ramses. This is because Weret is also the mother of Ramses. Ramses is also documented as being of the Lady of Weret. And this is Weret's hieroglyph that can be found in the temple of Ramses. So it all makes sense now when you put all of the pieces of the puzzle together. We have Ramses and Maya and his mother all in Egypt at the very same time that Horemheb usurps the kingdom. Maya comes into the land and he restores the temple of Tuthmosis, who is his father. And Ramses comes into the land and asserts himself as king of Egypt and reasserts the power of the Egyptians. Both of them have the same mother and father, Tuthmosis and Weret. This also explains why Ramses and Maya are the only two men in history to have restored the tomb of Tuthmosis. This is something that would only be done by the son of the king. Keep in mind that when Horemheb usurped the kingdom of Egypt and he commissioned Maya to come to Egypt, Maya already held all of the titles as overseer of the treasury, as the king's scribe and right hand. These are all titles that he held prior to Horemheb usurping the kingdom. These are all titles that were always held by the king's son. And this goes all the way back to the first dynasty, where we can see Rahotep, who holds all of the same titles as Maya. Now, the interesting thing about the one title that he holds, which is overseer of the treasury, the overseer of the treasury was responsible not only for the gold and the wealth of the Egyptians, which we know that when white people came to South America, they robbed the gold. And this is because the Mayan Empire itself, the Mayans themselves, were high priests of the Egyptians, and they were the overseers of the treasury. But the treasury did not just include gold. The main thing that the overseer of the treasury was overseeing was cotton. So we know that cotton was grown in North and South America in abundance for 3,000 years prior to the arrival of white people. So this also tells us that this is most likely how white people discovered South America in the first place. And it explains why they called these people the Mayans when they came. Um, you have to understand that it was white people who classified these people as the Mayans. They would have done this based on what they discovered about Maya. So it all makes sense. But more importantly, what this shows us is that Ramses and Maya were brothers. They are the ones who came into Egypt when Horemheb usurped the kingdom, and they are the ones who tried to reassert the power of the Egyptians in the land. So another important clue that shows us the connection between the Egyptians and the Mayans is Maya having this Chichen Itza language on the ceiling of his tomb shows us that he was from the location of Chichen Itza. This is a very important location because it's the main location that the Mayans would sacrifice their captives. Now we have to look at one important thing. How did the Mayans have white captives? How come the Mayans are documented as sacrificing and killing white captives prior to the arrival of white people in South America? Where did they get their white captives from? So if we look at this relief during this very same time that Maya is in Egypt and Ramses has ascended to the throne, we can see this stela of the sea people, and they're shown with their shields. So we can see the sea people who have invaded Egypt with their shields during the time of Ramses, and during this very same time, we see the Mayans with white captives who have shields. And these captives are being taken to Chichen Itza to be sacrificed. So what happened to the sea people who were taken captive by Ramses? And was this a practice that went on between the Egyptians and the Mayans for thousands of years? This practice of sacrificing white people. Because you have to understand that the Egyptians also sacrificed people. There were two types of sacrifices in ancient times. One was a retainer sacrifice, and the other was a sacrifice of captives. So the Egyptians have a lot of record. We have a lot of evidence that shows us the retainer sacrifices. And these are servants of the king who were killed when the king would die. So the king would die and all of his servants would be killed with him so that they would transition into the afterlife with the king. And there's a lot of evidence of this. We have the burial, a lot of the graves showing the mass graves of these retainer sacrifices. But when it comes to the sacrifice of captives, we don't know where the Egyptians sacrificed their captives of war. But if you look at Ramses, who is capturing the sea people holding their shields, and you look at his brother Maya, who comes from Chichen Itza, or the Mayan people, and you can see the Mayans with their captives holding their shields. These captives are going to be sacrificed to the gods. This clearly shows us the connection between South America and Egypt, and it shows us why the Mayans were sacrificing so many people. Because they were sacrificing the Egyptian captives of war. This is why it appears that the Mayans did nothing but sacrifice people, because they were the high priests of the Egyptians, and one of their jobs would have been to sacrifice all of these captives. And this is exactly what was going on during the time that Horemheb usurped the kingdom, during the very same time that Maya is in Egypt, and the very same time that Ramses is fighting the sea people. So another thing that we have to look at that's a very important part of this puzzle is the fact that we can't find hardly any bodies of any Mayan kings. Now we know that these people inhabited South America for thousands of years, but why is it that we can't find thousands of bodies? We should at least have hundreds of bodies, but there's only a handful that have been found. And when we look at Maya, who was from Chichen Itza. He was a Mayan, but yet he was buried in Egypt, dressed like the Egyptians, with Egyptian hieroglyphs and your typical Egyptian burial. It makes me wonder if all of the Mayan kings were buried in Egypt as well. And it would be hard to tell who was a Mayan and who was an Egyptian. Because if we look at Maya as an example, his burial and the way he is dressed like an Egyptian, it tells us that the Egyptians, when they were in Egypt, dressed like an Egyptian. When they were in South America, they dressed like the Mayans. So because of this, it makes it hard to tell who is who. But because white people have destroyed so much and desecrated so much in Egypt, we don't have much to go on. There isn't much evidence left to show us the connection between Egypt and South America. But the little evidence that we have on Maya tells us all we need to know. It shows us the connection between the Mayans and the Egyptians. It shows us that the Mayans were not only the high priests of the Egyptians, but they were also related by blood, and through the specific bloodline of Tuthmosis, who is the bloodline of your biblical King David. And the knowledge that white people had of Maya buried in Egypt, or of the Mayans, is what led them to South America in the first place.